Welcome to The Late Show. It is the 22nd of May. It's been quite a dramatic day. There's a Bible verse that says, "Do not boast about tomorrow, because you don't know what a day will bring." And that is certainly true of today, because we've had an announcement. It sort of half cropped up in Prime Minister's Question Time. A question from the Stephen Flynn, I think, from the Scottish National Party to the Prime Minister, when you're going to call the general election. And then the rumour mill started turning, and this afternoon it reached a fever pitch. And so at just after 5 o'clock this evening, Rishi Sunak announced that there will be a general election on the 4th of July. And I would like, before I introduce my guest, to just go across to Brenda from Bristol, if you remember this lady. And I think she sums up the sentiments of most of us. So please let's hear from Brenda in Bristol.
You're joking. Not another one?
Classic. Come on, tell me you haven't heard that one. It's an absolute classic. And of course, we've had a number of general elections in my lifetime. And of course, the Conservative Party have been in government for 14 years. But it's not only the UK that's having a general election. And I have a very eminent guest with me today, Thomas Sandell. He's the founding director of the European Coalition for Israel. And you know quite a lot about elections, and there's one coming up also in Europe. Tell us about that, Thomas.
Yes, of course. In 2 weeks' time, more or less, from the 6th to the 9th of June, there will be elections throughout the 27 EU member states. And as the viewers will remember, the UK is no longer an EU member state.
We're still Europeans.
You are still Europeans. We very much count on you for your support and cooperation. But these are very important elections, of course, and will decide the future of Europe. And I think also the Western institutions for years and years and come. And as you know, Tim, we are living in very critical times, and it's so interesting that just within 1 month, the whole of the European Union, and then the UK, and obviously later in the year also the US will vote for a new leadership.
Very dramatic. So we're going to drill into that, Thomas. I think we should show the Prime Minister giving his speech. We'll also give you some scriptures, and we'd very much like you to join us with your thoughts and comments and prayers, and if you have any insights from the scriptures. But first, we will hear from our current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, speaking outside Downing Street today and announcing that there will be a general election.
In the last 5 years, our country has fought through the most challenging times since the Second World War. As I stand here as your Prime Minister, I can't help but reflect that my first proper introduction to you was just over 4 years ago. I stood behind one of the podiums, upstairs in the building behind me. I told you that we faced a generation-defining moment, and that we as a society would not be judged by some government action, but by the small acts of kindness that we showed one another. You met that challenge, and then some, and I have never been prouder to be British. And when I introduced the furlough scheme, I did so not because I saw a country simply in need of desperate help, albeit we were, but because I saw a country whose future hung in the balance. I could be bold and trust in the tens of millions of you at home that you would rise to the moment, or I could accept the inevitable, millions of job losses, and pick up the pieces. In truth, it was no choice at all. I have never and will never leave the people of this country to face the darkest of days alone. And you know that because you've seen it. As I did then, I will forever do everything in my power to provide you with the strongest possible protection I can. That is my promise to you. Because for so many of us, it's easy to forget the scale of what we've been through. We were hit by a pandemic that upended normal life. Who would have thought that the government would ever tell us how many times a day we could leave our homes? Then, just as we were recovering from COVID, war returned to Europe. with Putin's invasion of Ukraine sending your energy bills spiraling. I came to office, above all, to restore economic stability. Economic stability is the bedrock of any future success, whether that is rising wages and good jobs, investment in our public services, or the defence of the country. And because of our collective sacrifice and your hard work, we have reached 2 major milestones in delivering that stability, showing that when we work together, anything is possible. Our economy is now growing faster than anyone predicted, outpacing Germany, France, and the United States. And this morning it was confirmed that inflation is back to normal. This means that the pressure on prices will ease and mortgage rates will come down. This is proof that the plan and priorities I set out are working. I recognise that it has not always been easy. Some of you will only just be starting to feel the benefits, and for some, it might still be hard when you look at your bank balance. But this hard-earned economic stability was only ever meant to be the beginning. The question now is how, and who do you trust to turn that foundation into a secure future for you, your family, and our country. Now is the moment for Britain to choose its future, to decide whether we want to build on the progress we have made or risk going back to square one with no plan and no certainty. Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July. This election will take place at a time when the world is more dangerous than it has been since the end of the Cold War.
So you'll probably hear that speech on various news channels, but we thought that, we couldn't let them be the only ones telling you. And people might not believe me, Thomas, if I say it's going to happen on the 4th of July. Just as he's saying, we're living in a very dangerous world. I thought we could read from Psalm 46, and we're approaching Psalm 46 with our Bible studies, but I'm going to steal the march. And we'll read from verse 6 and 7. The nations raged, the kingdoms were moved. He uttered his voice. This is the Lord uttered his voice. The earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Selah. It's quite a dramatic psalm. 1848, Thomas, there was a real uproar. Across Europe, there were many nations that were in a revolution. It was all happened within the space of a year. But it seems as though we're in a similar time now. That the stability of a few years ago in Europe has started to disintegrate. Is that a fair comment? Speaking as an outsider from Britain.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think when political scientists and historians try to look and see anything that could be compared to where we are today, there are, of course, a number of examples. And one is, of course, also the end of the Second World War, when all our international institutions that have been functioning relatively well up to this point. So today we are seriously looking at what we call the international rule of law-based system crumbling. Yeah. And that includes everything from the European Union all the way to the United Nations. Yeah. And if we look 5 years towards the future, we don't know what the world will look like, but what we do know with some certainty is that it will be very different. Mm.
And what bearing, because you're a specialist really, you meet with diplomats, with politicians across Europe, you know the lie of the land as it is now. There's a European election, I think between the 6th and the 9th of June, so a month before our election. And so as the land lies now, you know where the pro-Israel countries are, and without mentioning names, are politicians who are supportive. How will that change in these coming elections? Because we know, from the news that there's going to be a shift to the right. What bearing will that have on relations with Israel, bilaterally between countries and Europe and Israel, but also the EU and Israel.
Yeah. Well, Tim, we did something very interesting, something which has not been available ahead of other EU elections, and that is that we commissioned the Research Institute, EU Matrix in Brussels, to do a vote ranking. So they were looking at all the votes related to Israel through this 5-year electoral term to give each political party in the European Parliament a ranking, a number. And they are currently 198 of them. So we have the data.
Yeah.
To, people can go to our website to find out for themselves, but it's very clear. And there is a trend as well, and I don't say this with any preference to either side, but there is a clear trend from the political right to the political left, which is very different from traditionally, say, pre-1967, when it was more the Social Democrats in Europe who were pro-Israel. Today that has shifted, so it's almost like the more you go to the right, the more pro-Israel they tend to be, and the same the more you go to the left. So these are some of the things that we've been able to, to use our data.
And we're at a time when, institutions like the International Criminal Court are putting out an international arrest warrant against Netanyahu, and that's dividing nations, because we hear Biden coming out against it, saying it's outrageous to equate Israel with Hamas, and obviously Britain and Cameron, Boris Johnson, they were all coming out. But suddenly Macron pops up and says, well, we've got to enforce international law. That's Israel is causing divisions in Europe, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Coming back to Macron, this is often what happens in political life. Someone makes a statement, the next day they modify.
Yeah.
And so today that statement was modified to say that you cannot make a comparison between Hamas and the democratically elected government of Israel. But it's true, you have, and this is also something that our research proved in a very clear way, that Europe is divided. On the one hand, you can say that countries in the Central and Eastern Europe are much more pro-Israel. I think there's one easy solution, one easy explanation. They lived under a totalitarian regime.
Yeah.
They know the difference. But then, so you can also say you have a top country like Poland, Czech, and Romania, Hungary, I should say. But also in Western Europe, you have some very interesting new developments with Italy being very pro-Israel at the moment, and the same for Austria. And we have to remember,
that's interesting.
Austria was the birthplace of Adolf Hitler.
Yes, and dare I mention Kurt Waldheim,
of course,
former Secretary General of the UN, but we might not go to the UN in this program.
No.
But Germany's been
coming back
pro-Israel.
Coming back to the ICC, which you mentioned,
please.
I think it's important because that's the second part of your question. We have countries that are very clearly anti-Israel. I would mention 3 of them, and all these 3 are now in the process of recognizing a Palestinian state.
Yes.
So you have Ireland, you have Spain, and you have Belgium.
Yeah.
And
Norway, apparently.
Well, Norway, like UK, they're not part of the European Union.
Oh, yes, sorry, no.
But nevertheless,
Nevertheless,
they're in the same group.
And they are, really, they're flag wavers, really, almost for Hamas. In the light of October the 7th, how could you possibly reward Hamas with their demands?
Yeah, no, it is, for me, it's really a mystery how we can lose our directions in our moral compass to this extent. But again, it's not a surprise that it's primarily these 3 countries that I mentioned. And Ireland, of course, has a very long history of anti-Israel policies. And, sometimes I make comparison to what happens in the entertainment world. And some of us may have watched the Eurovision, and it was interesting again that Ireland and Israel were like ones that were competing.
The Irish contestants didn't think the Israeli contestants should even be in the competition.
Yeah,
That's how
correct.
nasty it was.
Yeah.
It's interesting, you can't divide Europe on religious grounds, because you could say, well, Ireland's Catholic, but then so's Poland. And Poland is pro-Israel, so that's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Because, you know, speaking from my experience of traveling to Israel over many years, you know, often the traditional churches, the ancient churches, have Arab patriarchs and Arab leaders, and they can often inform, say for instance the Latin patriarch in Jerusalem could inform, it was Mikhail Sava in my days 20 odd years ago, inform the Catholic world on an anti-Israel position. But that's not, it's interesting that it doesn't follow.
No. If I could comment on that,
please.
because it's quite interesting. It relates back also to the World Council of Churches. And we've had discussions with the World Council of Churches, which you may know is, they have quite a problematic view on Israel, and not to say that they have been also igniting what we call new anti-Semitism. And for them it's very easy. They say, we're doing this because of the pleas from our member churches. And obviously in the what they call the Holy Land, those member churches would be Arab Christians who are not less, you know, I may go out on a limb, but I was going to say they're not less anti-Israel than what the Muslim population is.
That's right.
And
often they're intimidated by Muslim leaders. I've seen that with the Christian patriarchs, not wanting to upset, of course, the Muslim leaders.
Yeah, but I think it goes beyond that with what we call Christian anti-Semitism. Yeah. But it raises the interesting question to say, well, what about that which we call Messianic churches? Couldn't they be part of the World Council of Churches, and they could then raise their concerns? It's just an interesting thought.
Yeah, exactly. Now, in the interest of balance, sorry, this is very parochial, Thomas, and we're very quirky in England, so that when our great Prime Minister is giving his speech outside 10 Downing Street, you hear someone playing with a loudspeaker the victory tune of Tony Blair in 1997, but that's England. And he didn't, as you said, he didn't even have an umbrella, you know, keeping the rain off his shoulders. But in the interest of balance, we have Her Majesty's opposition leader, Keir Starmer. So could you bear with us as we play Keir Starmer's, this is Keir Starmer's speech in response to Rishi Sunak announcing the general election. And then after we've played this, we'll talk a little more, but please keep emailing in, and I'll talk a little bit more with Thomas, especially about these elections and other elections around the world. And then we will read some of your emails. Thank you very much.
Wants to change for the better. Your future, your community, your country. Now, it will feel like a long campaign, I'm sure of that. But no matter what else is said and done, that opportunity for change is what this election is about. Over the course of the last 4 years, we've changed the Labour Party, returned it once more to the service of working people. All we ask now, humbly, is to do exactly the same for our country and return Britain to the service of working people. To that purpose, we offer 3 reasons why you should change Britain with Labour. 1, because we will stop the chaos. Look around our country. The sewage in our rivers, people waiting on trolleys in A&E, crime virtually unpunished, mortgages and food prices through the roof. It's all, every bit of it, a direct result of the Tory chaos in Westminster. Time and again, they pursue their own interests rather than tackling the issues that affect your family. And if they get another 5 years, they will feel entitled to carry on exactly as they are. Nothing will change. A vote for Labour is a vote for stability, economic and political. A politics that treads more lightly on all our lives. A vote to stop the chaos. 2, because it's time for change. Our offer is to reset both our economy and our politics so that they once again serve the interests of working people. We totally reject the Tory view that economic strength is somehow gifted from those at the top. Over the past 14 years, through all the crises we've had to face, sticking with that idea has left our country exposed, insecure, and unable to unlock the potential of every community. But a vote for Labour is a vote to turn the page on all that. A vote for change. And finally, 3, because we have a long-term plan to rebuild Britain. A plan that is ready to go, fully costed and fully funded. We can deliver economic stability, cut the NHS waiting times, secure our borders with a new border security command, harness great British energy to cut your bills for good, tackle antisocial behaviour, and get the teachers we need in your children's classroom.
That was Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party. Sorry about the glitches. It wasn't deliberate from us. I remember there was a presidential debate once with Ronald Reagan and Bob Dole, I think it was, and they put the lights underneath Bob Dole, so he looked almost demonic. No, but we're not into that kind of game. But I have to say, we have other parties standing. So you have the Green Party of Plaid Cymru in Wales, you have the SNP in Scotland, and of course you have Reform Party, who play probably quite a big role if they do stand against the Conservatives, you know, across the country. Yeah, so we're quite fragmented. We used to be the United Kingdom, Thomas, but you know, it's interesting that we've, you know, there's quite a lot of different people putting up their political slogans. Right, can we go back to Europe, if that's okay? Because my wife's German, by the way. I know a little bit about the Judeo-Christian heritage of Europe, the Reformation, you know, and we've got a strong tradition. You come from the Scandinavian countries. There's a strong heritage there. What's happening on that front, on the Christian front, or the Judeo-Christian values front?
I don't think it's so different from the UK. I mean, when we're looking basically at the Western world, we see it in I mean, the US is often an exception in that, you know, they have a vibrant economy. They combine modernity with a vibrant religious life, whereas in Europe it has been going in the other direction. Yeah. To the extent, of course, that today we, you know, as Christians are pushed from 2 sides. One, radical Islam, the other one, very secularized, what we today call wokeism.
Yes.
And it's not easy, obviously, for those with traditional Christian views to stand in the public sphere and in public life.
And also, we were sort of touching on it before, you know, within the Christian world, there's also a division on the subject of Israel. Yeah. You know, you have, because we live with it, but it's interesting, it's a theological, there's a theological root to it, isn't there, Thomas? Would you say that?
I think it's a combination. I used to think that it was a theological problem. I'm not so convinced anymore. I think it's just as much a political worldview problem, and secondly, I think it's a problem of ignorance. For most people, it's a non-issue, and they're not interested in it. And but
so like the students demonstrating, they're not that well informed, are they?
Absolutely not. But of course, also it is a question of biblical literacy. Yeah. And you know, this is, you may remember when we were discussing a European constitution.
Yes.
And it was decided that God could not be mentioned in any shape or form in that constitution. I think that was really a devastated decision. And we see the consequences today. And
that was not to upset Islam. I mean, there was a factor there, wasn't there? Because there's been a large influx.
Yeah,
not just in the UK.
I think there were two pushbacks. During those times we were still discussing EU membership for Turkey, and it's so unbelievable to think back and understand that this was really in the pipeline. And then it was said politically that Europe shouldn't be a Christian club, the Turks should be welcomed as well. But then it was from the secular part of Europe. It was really, at the end of the day, it was France and Belgium who vetoed God in the constitution.
Yeah, I was there. I think we should just mention a little bit about the European Coalition for Israel, because you founded it, was it about 20 years ago? And I went to one of your early meetings and this was the topic of discussion.
Of course, yeah.
But what's the vision behind the European Coalition?
It's a very simple vision, and it also goes back to the times of the Second Intifada and the first rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, where it was very clear that there was no Christian voice in the public arena. And Elie Wiesel, the late Elie Wiesel, famously asked, where are all the others? Why is it that it's still only the Jews who are speaking out when Jews are persecuted? And I felt personally that a call to see a coalition of all the others, be raised up, and that's of course a coalition of Christian believers, majority religion in Europe, and I think we have a huge responsibility, especially in times like these.
Absolutely.
So that was 2003, and now we've been going for more than 21 years.
That's amazing.
And there's still work to be done.
That's when Revelation TV started.
That's right. I think a lot.
Valentine's Day.
So a lot of good things happened
in that year.
Yeah.
And then just before I go through to your emails, thank you. And if you want to ask any questions about the European situation, there's no better time than tonight. But just to mention, you're going to be launching the European reports. And some of our viewers will remember in the European Parliament, you were actually interviewing MPs and others. We can see some footage there. Just tell us a little bit about your plans for the European report.
Well, the European report, of course, has been going on for many years, and in good cooperation with Revelation TV, actually, and yes. Simon Barrett, who was moderating these programs for many years.
Yeah.
Then came the pandemic and COVID, and everything stopped, and we relaunched about 2 years later. And now, of course, there will be a new European Parliament in session starting in September. Okay. And the idea is that we will again continue the cooperation with Revelation TV. Yeah. So you will be able to watch us from Brussels every month.
Brilliant. And that will be in the autumn.
That will be in the autumn, yes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Right. I'm going to read your emails in order, and we've got some more scriptures, so we've got plenty to go on. We're about halfway through the programme. Paul and Ruth say, what is the connection with the EU election on the 6th of June, and then ours in the UK on the 4th of July?
Good question.
There is a connection.
I think it's, yeah. As I mentioned, I think there is a connection between what happens in the US, the UK, yeah. and Europe.
Yeah.
And we have to remember the situation that we are in. We're in a war in Ukraine. We're in a trade war with another major country in the world.
Yeah.
And then we have the whole situation in the Middle East, where with very different perceptions of what a democracy should look like. So we have radical Islam on the one hand, and there is liberal democracies. So UK.
Ironically, by the way, Turkey siding with Hamas.
Yes.
And giving them an office and a base in Istanbul.
A NATO member. So I think US, UK, and Europe need to stand shoulder to shoulder.
Yeah.
This is not the time to go solo. We need one another.
Yeah, that's an excellent answer. Eddie writes, Carlsberg don't do election campaign songs, but if they did, they would say things can only get better. I think that's what you're saying, Eddie. And Eddie's one of our regular viewers, and he always signs off as atheist. And well, actually, on this one, he says atheist for Israel.
Okay.
Could he be a member of the ECI?
I like him already.
And now this is my anonymous texter who just says evening. Oh no, sorry, it's not anonymous. It's Jason who's writing. He said it's a great episode regarding Israel and the Jews. May they prosper who love thee. There's a wonderful scripture there. And also Sean from Scotland is saying Rishi's lack of an umbrella at the announcement of the general election was probably a conserved resource. Peace to you. It was quite strange to see, and I did hear that some Conservative MPs were not happy about him announcing an early election, but the logic behind it was that one of his great pledges is that he'll stop the boats, and the problem is in the summer there'll be a lot of boats coming over again, as they do whenever the weather improves. So that will be damaging. And then also we had the very good news on inflation. I think it went down to 2.3%. And that was one of his other pledges, that he would bring inflation down. Because when he became Prime Minister, might give you a little history lesson, but when he became Prime Minister, he said inflation was about 10%. So he said that's one of my great pledges. Thomas was asking earlier about the dates of our general elections, and it has gone messy. So I'll just give everyone an update as we've got time, and we're waiting for your emails to come in. But the Conservative Party has been in for 14 years. Came in 2010 with David Cameron, who came out with a grand announcement there'll be a fixed term Parliament Act. So every Parliament would be 5 years long. So he was in coalition with the Liberal Democrats in 2010. In 2015, he won outright on this fixed term Parliament. Then, as you remember, the Brexit vote in 2016 unseated David Cameron. So Theresa May came in. And quite shortly afterwards, I think maybe a year later, Theresa May went to the country. So we had an election in 2017. But she was very confident, but she reduced her majority in that election. And then we had, she was in trouble from then onwards with her own party. And before long, Boris Johnson, who was the foreign minister, unseated her and became Prime Minister in 2018. In 2019, Boris Johnson went to the country and had an 80-seat majority, November 2019. That was our last general election. Then we had COVID. Boris Johnson got into trouble with his parties, COVID parties. He was unseated by his own party and Parliament. Liz Truss replaced him. Rishi Sunak stood against Liz Truss, and the parliamentary party didn't vote for Rishi Sunak. Liz Truss was in for such a short time that even shorter than Theresa May. So she came in 2020, if I'm right, 2021. And but she made such a mess of her mini budget, her emergency budget. Rishi Sunak came in to stabilise the ship, and he's been in for not a very long time. But around 2 years ago, he was the one who pressed the button on Boris Johnson. So the wheel has turned right round, and Rishi Sunak's now facing the electorate for the first time. Yeah, I did mention Theresa May. Yeah, so that's basically what happened, and that gave me time to get another email through, Thomas. But if you have any questions about our quirky country, please do,
No, of course. I think what you experience in the UK is also very similar to Europe as a whole. There is this fragmentation and polarization. And this is something we see ahead of the EU elections. We expect the two extremes in a way to win big, whereas the middle ground, the center, is really struggling at the moment, where messaging needs to be very clear, black and white, and simplistic. Yeah. And that will also be a challenge for us to in a way to find the middle ground, and also even a culture of dialogue and a civilized culture, which is not always easy.
No, and it's got worse, hasn't it? And the election that Boris Johnson won was against a very extreme pro-Hamas Jeremy Corbyn. So it's amazing to think that just at the last election we had, you know, a left-wing Marxist who they were questioning whether he would even bow before the Queen. You know, he's anti-monarchist, so that's how things can change. Yeah. But I note also in Holland, you know, Geert Wilders, you know, considered quite extreme on the right, very outspoken on Islam, and yet he won the popular vote. Yeah. So, you know, there's some big swings going on across Europe.
Yeah. And there are, you know, many elephants in the room, the big questions, and I think everyone agrees today that there's been some mishandling of some of these issues, that including migration.
Yes.
And now in a way it's a time of reckoning, and people are, you know, concerned about the developments, and of course also what we see on our college campuses across Europe, and this radicalization, which also partly is imported and financed from abroad. So, and I think your Prime Minister spoke well. You know, yeah. I say this as an outsider. I never get to vote in these elections, and but I'm sure the new person.
Yes, he's also. Contender. You couldn't say that because his wife is Jewish, Keir Starmer. Yeah. And he has got into trouble with his party because bear in mind that it's like the rump of the Jeremy Corbyn supporters are still in the party. Yeah. So he was quite brave to come out in support of Israel.
Yeah. Which is similar to the US, and you have Biden, yes. and the Democratic Party, where you have the old guard, which is very pro-Israel, and then you have a new generation, which is very radicalized in a way, anti-Israel.
Yeah, exactly.
And you see this in many countries.
Exactly. A few more emails?
Of course.
Thank you very much for everyone who's writing in. Lynn, Evening Tim, a very interesting programme. However, I think for the sake of clarity for your viewers, you should distinguish between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland in relation to their attitude to Israel. I do remember... You're quite right, actually, Lynn. We can slip into thinking of the island of Ireland, but actually there is a Southern Irish Republic, and also there is Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. Course, yeah. So thank you for saying that. In relation, you're saying they're very different in relation to their attitude to Israel, because Northern Ireland's very supportive.
Yeah. Maybe I should clarify that yes, only one of those islands are part of the EU.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, no, that's a moot point because of the border.
Of course.
The Northern Ireland Protocol means that Northern Ireland is sort of being sucked in a little in terms of trade. Yeah. That's a bit of an debate there. I do remember being told by a colleague, Lynn says, many years ago that in Protestant areas of Belfast, the residents fly the flag of Israel. I have seen that being over there, Lynn, which is amazing, really, among some of the more militant flags that you see flying up there. Tony says, I feel it is important to make viewers aware that the Conservatives and Labour leaders are members of the World Economic Forum. Perhaps you can enlighten views on what the WEF means. Well, what you've just said, World Economic Forum. I think if I'm right, that Klaus Schwab, he's in his 80s, he's just retired. Yeah. And there is discussion that Tony Blair is being lined up as a potential future.
I think Tony...
But that may be a conspiracy theory, I don't know.
I think that would be a downgrade of Tony Blair. I think he's prominent where he is now, in his own institute.
Yeah, he does. He sort of is a bit of a supremo. Yeah. I remember him being discussed once that he could become a president of a united Europe.
Of course,
but,
yes.
That didn't happen.
Yeah.
This is from Marion, Ireland and Israel. I'm from Ireland and I love Israel. I pray for Israel and support the vision for Israel. There are quite a few people in Ireland who love Israel, a remnant, mainly evangelical Christians like me, and there are also people in the general public who are not all anti-Israel. I'm very saddened at the attitude of many of our elected leaders towards Israel. They certainly don't represent me or many of my friends, and the Eurovision Song Contest entry was shameful, to be honest. Ireland was once a bright light to the nations during the Dark Ages, and we are praying for revival and a fresh outpouring of the Spirit on our nation once again in these last days.
Maybe I can comment on
Yes,
Ireland
please do.
again. I met actually an EU civil servant, a believer, recently, and he brought up the subject, and he told me he knew about the political stance of the government, but he said if you are to find those who would be sympathetic, you'll find them among those reading the Bible-believing Christians. And evangelical, and including Catholic evangelicals. So that only confirms what our friend is saying.
What Marion said.
Yeah.
I think that Eurovision Song Contest entry wasn't just, she wasn't just hostile to Israel.
No.
I think I did watch it. In fact, it's the first time I've watched the Eurovision for maybe 30 years, but it was shocking, actually, to see the degradation, the depravity of some of the acts.
Perhaps I should say that I was not too proud of the Finnish contribution either.
No, that's right. It was one of three which I would say were the most dubious, alongside the British, which was shocking, the Irish, and you're right.
Yeah.
I didn't want to say that. I was trying to be diplomatic. And now Dorry writes, Douglas Murray, the one who brings joy to my heart, received an award in Israel for his journalism. He just demolishes all the anti-Semites in debates, claims most of his friends are Jewish by the grace of God, and declared he's not an atheist, more an agnostic. God bless him, and we're praying for his salvation. I've known Douglas Murray for many, many years. I don't know whether you know, he's a writer and commentator.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Wrote, dare I say, The Strange Death of Europe, which was warning about the immigrants, but also The Madness of Crowds, which was very clear about how, social contagion has taken over with the lifestyle and Stonewall's influence. So
I would consider him one of the most prominent public intellectuals at our time.
Yeah, and I met him. He wrote. I knew him quite well. I knew everyone 20 years ago, like you. But I met him and spent quite a lot of time chatting with him about Israel. Even then, he ran something called the Centre for Social Cohesion. But then, when Chris Hitchens wrote his book "God Is Not Great," he was quite close to Chris Hitchens. And then Douglas wrote in the Spectator newspaper. You may be interested in this story. Why I am an atheist. Oh. And I met him quite shortly afterwards, and I looked Douglas in the eye and said, Douglas, I don't believe you're an atheist. So I'm very pleased that he's now said that he's an agnostic. I think that's a more, I wouldn't say honest, it's actually a more defensible position.
Yeah.
Because how can anyone say there is no God?
Yeah. I heard one of his latest speeches, and I think this may have been the one that was referred to in the email, and he quoted scripture.
That's right.
Yeah, you don't do that if you don't consider, Bible to be a relevant book for our times.
And Israel is a remarkable story of survival of a people who are following the ancient scriptures.
Absolutely.
And it's a country that has scriptures everywhere.
Yeah. And as you know, Tim, there is what we almost could call a revival in these public intellectual circles.
Yes.
And Israel seems to be a uniting factor.
Yeah.
So once people start to get Israel, they also understand that there's something which goes way beyond, the startup nation. And I think Douglas Murray is a good example of that. But there are others. And
I would say a correlation to the value of human life.
Absolutely.
Because the God, the God of the New and the Old Testament is the God who made man in his own image with innate value, the value of all human life. And I think that's a good starting point in any political discussion, actually valuing people. Yeah. My local member of Parliament came into Parliament today. It's overshadowed by the general election, Craig McKinley, he's lost both hands and both feet amputated because of sepsis. And it does make you just sit back and put politics to one side. And everyone in Parliament clapped him across all of the parties, because he had a 5% chance of survival from this sepsis attack. And it's quite moving. Yeah, and you realise, we might have political differences, but they're still made in God's image, and the Lord Jesus died for them. That's something that should also make us just step back sometimes when we can become very polarised and critical. How can we trust, this is from Cynthia, how can we trust the EU when some allies of Iran stood in silence at the EU for the president of Iran who died in the helicopter crash? I'm going to put that question to you before I put my...
Yeah, of course. I think he stood in good company in that respect with the UK at the UN Security Council. I think the US as well. But it's true. I mean, I don't, I'm very much aware of the problems within the EU, and as has been mentioned, that many have difficulties to seeing the difference between totalitarian Islamic regimes and parliamentary democracies such as Israel.
Yeah. The last, since October the 7th, there has been, a swing. Initially great sympathy, everyone showing the Israeli flag on Downing Street, on the Arc de Triomphe, I think, and it was everywhere. And then, of course, the war against Hamas started, and there's been a swing back. And then when the Iranians, in April, sent 300 plus rockets to Israel, people thought, wow, so there seemed to be a kind of swing again back in support of Israel. They're quite, international leaders are quite fickle, aren't they?
Yeah, it's at the end of the day, it's all about national interest. I spoke to a very prominent Jewish leader once, and he said, Thomas, remember, never try to convince anyone with a moral argument or an ethical argument to say, well, we need to support Israel because they do the right thing. It's all about self-interest, sadly.
We've got another scripture, and I always like to bring these in. It's in Isaiah 40, and I'm triggered when I think about Raisi and that helicopter. And of course, everyone is going to be accountable, not to you or me, but to God, who's the judge of all. But this is a good scripture, I think, just for us to reflect on, especially in the context of elections. He brings the princes to nothing or to naught. He makes the judges of the earth useless. I don't know which translation that is, but the scriptures are quite powerful. The United Nations, and I know you have travelled there many times and been involved there on behalf of Israel with ECI. They have outside, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. But they miss out the pretext, as it were, of the verse, which is the word of the Lord will go forth from Zion. Isn't that the missing element in world peacemaking?
Yeah. It is, and for us, as we said many times, it's always, very easy to find the right context when you speak to UN diplomats, because this is how, internationally they would define world peace. There's no better way to define world peace. And to start with, there was no reference to where this grand idea came from, and only later on, Isaiah, the scripture quote was mentioned. But that gives us a very good bridge to say, well, listen, this is what we're talking about, and let's look at it in context, that there will be this time when the nations will stream up to the, to Jerusalem and learn of the ways of the God of Jacob. Yeah. So that's, in a way, to explain what we're doing as CCI is to try to illustrate this principle. Yeah,
it's quite hard when you go into the foyer of the United Nations. So you've got this wonderful statue of, the plough outside. When they have these pro-Palestinian displays in their main entrance, as though the whole institution is it's supportive.
It's important to remember that when the United Nations were founded in 1945, the founding members were all basically what we would call Western democracies, liberal democracies. Whereas today, as liberal democracies, we are in a minority.
Yeah, that is
and that explains a lot why the UN is then drawing certain conclusions.
That is such a good point. Thank you for that. I hadn't thought of that. Carl says, well, I'll read a few emails together now so I don't miss anyone out. But Carl says, have the Conservatives an oven-ready deal or on unfettered trade involving the UK and mainland Europe? That was one of the things Boris Johnson promised. I don't know whether that was with America. He also said we can have our cake and eat it, you know, just slogans.
Yeah.
And that we will, you know, be able to save 350 million, I think, which can go to support the NHS. Those sorts of things were quite, it's popular politics basically, and it's always quite effective. You're too diplomatic to comment. This is and finally, I've got my anonymous texter who's written, a lot of people will laugh, but I still think Nigel Farage should stand for Prime Minister. He sorted the EU for us and no one would dare to stand against him. The interesting thing, you will know him very well from the European Parliament. He's very, he's probably the most able politician to think on his feet. He doesn't need notes. And apparently there's going to be a news conference tomorrow with the Reform Party and they're going to announce their position. And it's possible that Nigel Farage could stand again. He's stood many times for Parliament and not succeeded. Also, there's been a comment that he might want to go to support Trump in America. But because our election now is earlier, he may just think, oh, well, I've got nothing to lose. It's 1 month, 6 weeks. So he could decide to re-enter politics.
I thought he was aiming at becoming the UK ambassador in
Washington. No, he toys with people and doesn't tell them. But now it's like now or never, because the election isn't in November. You know, he has to make a decision fairly shortly, I think. Okay, we've got the last 5 minutes. I'll just read these. This is from Susan. There is so much going on at the moment, but I was shocked to read an account from Michelle O'Neill, she's the Sinn Féin First Minister of Northern Ireland, saying that Hamas would one day be a partner for peace. Has she read the Hamas Charter? ? She also called for a Palestinian state and said that Gaza was a graveyard for children. This is very alarming. The whole interview with Andrew Marr is available on YouTube. Has anyone seen it? I haven't seen it. It's interesting what you said, Susan, because we were saying how supportive Northern Ireland is, but Northern Ireland is split between, you know, largely still on sectarian grounds. Michelle O'Neill is Sinn Féin First Minister. There's a lot of politics happening at the moment. John says, as an Irish Catholic, I feel sad what our government did today. There was a chat show on here today and quite a few people were disgusted like me. I do enjoy your shows, especially the discussions. I find them well thought out and have learnt a lot from you on Israel. That's nice. And you're going to learn a lot more, John, if you tune into the European reports, which will be coming out in the autumn, and Thomas will be presenting that programme from the European Parliament.
Yes.
Great. I did let slip my views on Brexit to Thomas before the programme, but I'll bite my tongue now. Tony writes, I can say that the general majority of the public in Ireland is pro-Israel. From my experience, it is the current secular, godless government and its media that is pushing this agenda. Evident also in the 2 recent referendums where all Irish political parties were pushing for a yes vote, but the public defeated both with the largest no vote in our history. Our government is out of touch and have become full of their own importance, trying to railroad the will of the people with woke ideologies galore. The elections are coming up and independents are looking like gaining on these in power. You mentioned the woke situation. Generally, folks who adopt the woke agenda are not supportive of Israel. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say, and And of course, it's also a generational question. I think those, as we mentioned earlier, at the college campuses today, or some of the most prestigious ones, clearly buy into a woke agenda, however we define it, anti, being against any norm whatsoever.
Yeah.
And with the distinct calling, which you may say that Israel has in the world, and also how Israel as a nation, unlike other nations, have such a clear legacy in the Bible, I think it makes people of that conviction very nervous.
Yeah. So let's just read, as I promised. It says Daniel 2, verse 21, as we're just closing the program. Daniel 2, verse 21, and he, this is God again, changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. So that's our prayer for the leaders, and pray for those who are in authority. I've got one more quickly, if it's not too long, Sean. It probably is a bit too long. You're talking about visiting Israel, and your first visit was in May 2008, and you visited Bethlehem in the May. You were nervous. You could go on. Well, can we quickly just listen to Brenda again to close the show? Brenda from Bristol.
You're joking. Not another one?
Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you so much, Thomas Sandell. We look forward to seeing you on the European report, and we look forward to seeing the results of the European elections coming up. Bless
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.